All right, this is the lecture for the first unit in the second semester entitled Nationalistic Revolutions Sweep the West. It's summarized by just the term nationalism on the class page, and I'll usually use that to refer to this unit. We're looking at a lot of different revolutions that happened all over the world, largely because of the Enlightenment, and we're going to start today with the section entitled Latin American People Win Independence. So this is a map of Latin America. You can see from 1800 to 1830, Latin America went from a deeply colonized part of the world to a largely independent part of the world. And there's a lot of conflict that led to that. So let's look at some of the areas of that. First thing about Latin American colonies is their almost uncomfortable use of race to define a person's status in the New World. So this chart here is going to define the different racial categories. You can use these to fill in your vocab words. And we have at the top were the Peninsulares, were the people that were Iberian or Spanish. So these were people that were born in Spain and had a heritage back to the Old World, and so they were at the top of the social structure. Pure Spanish, born in Spain. And then slightly underneath them were the Creoles, and these were also pure Spanish, but they just happened to be born in the New World. So because of that slight difference, they were a tier down in the social structure and didn't have the same rights and opportunities that Peninsulares did. Further down from there are different racial groupings. The mestizos were a combination of white and Indian, and mulattoes are a combination of white and African. That term now has a negative racial connotation, so it's not one we'd want to throw around, but it is a descriptive historical sort of word, so we should know what it means. And then there's just Indian, Native Americans, and just Africans to finish out the social structure. So we understand the idea of race dividing people in our country, but this takes it to another level. It's very intense. All right, of these Latin American countries that were colonies, the first one to fight for independence was the nation of Haiti. Today it's called Haiti. Back then it was called the colony of Saint Dominique. And the leader of this movement was a former slave named Toussaint L'Ouverture. And his story is kind of similar to some slaves in the Caribbean. They kind of had a unique story where they would start off as slaves, but earn their independence or take their independence, and then have some accomplishments and some wealth a little as well. He's an example of some slaves that happened to in the Caribbean. All right, so there it is, L'Ouverture. All right, and so it's the slaves leading the rebellion in the Caribbean. In South America, it's the Creoles. These are people that were just as racially pure, so to speak, as Peninsulares, but because of where they were born, they had a secondary status. So they were wealthy, they were educated, they had family history, and yet they didn't have opportunity. So they rebelled, and they led the revolt in South America. All right, the two individuals that were like the George Washingtons of South America, so to speak, were Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. And they both helped free different portions of South America. So if you write their names down for number 4 and then put a hyphen next to their name, we'll look at what nations they were responsible for freeing. So first, for Simón Bolívar, he helped free Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and if you're familiar with the geography of South America, you recognize that as northern South America. So that's where he was fighting to liberate those colonies. And then José de San Martín helped free Chile and Argentina. And if you're familiar with the geography of South America, that's in the south. So they both fought in their areas. And then they unified together to join their forces to help free Peru. And that's because that was the headquarters of the Spanish Empire. So it was their best fortified location. They needed both of them to be able to do that. All right, so it's the Creoles in South America. A slightly different experience in Mexico and Central America, where the mestizos and the Indians were the ones that rose up against the Spanish. The Creoles were satisfied with the way society was structured, so they actually fought with the Spanish, unlike South America, where they were leading the charge against the Spanish. All right, the revolt in Mexico was led by a priest of all things. This is an overly dramatic, highly emotional picture here I found of the priest, Miguel Hidalgo. And you can just stare at this for a minute and take in the references and a bit extreme nature of this picture, this cartoon here. But he's the leader of this revolt in Mexico against the Spanish, and he is a priest, believe it or not. All right, after Hidalgo was killed in battle, leadership passed to Morelos, and he led the Indians and mestizos against the Spanish and continued that charge. But this wasn't a successful rebellion until the Creoles decided if the Spanish were gone, they'd be in charge. So they switched sides. And under the leadership of Iturbide, the Creoles switched sides. They had been fighting with the Spanish, and then they decided to fight against the Spanish, kick the Spanish out, and then they figured, hey, with the Spanish gone, we're in charge. So that turned the tide for the rebellion in Mexico. After the Spanish were gone, a lot of the Central American countries, all those countries you would recognize on a map today between Mexico and South America, broke away from Mexico and became Central America and independent countries and things like that. So it didn't stay unified like it was under the Spanish. All right, and then last but not least, there's one country, one major country in Latin America that wasn't under Spanish control that has a different story, and that was Brazil. So briefly here, when Napoleon first invaded Portugal, the king and queen fled Portugal and took their family with them and went to Brazil and kind of relocated the government to Brazil. And then once Napoleon was defeated, they left Brazil and they went back to Portugal and took the government with them, reestablished their monarchy back in Portugal. But they left their son back in Brazil to rule sort of like as a 1A in charge under the king, under his father. His name was Dom Pedro, and he was left as a regent to rule under his father in place of his father in Brazil to prepare him to eventually be the king of Portugal. All right, but I guess he decided, because of the pushing of the Creoles in Brazil, that it'd be better to rule by himself instead of under his father. So he declared Brazil independence, separate from Portugal, declared himself the king of Brazil, this newly independent country, and that's how Brazil became independent, making family meetings from that point on incredibly awkward. All right, there's some positive and negative results of imperialism. Let's look at those real quick. I didn't leave you the space on your note sheet, but there's a lot of space under 13 and 14. You can fill those in. So, first one, nationalism. This idea of nations focusing on their own nations as opposed to domestic matters. They focus on domestic matters instead of international matters. So when countries are highly focused on their own agendas and their own advancement, a lot of times that leads to technological advances. They discover things, and citizens within the country create things and become super creative and stuff like that. Another positive result is people uniting. When there's this movement for nationalism across the country, pro-nation. We hear a lot of that verbiage today and that term nationalism being used in our country today. But a lot of people typically set aside differences and unite together. Like after September 11th, different people who probably would have had a hard time being around each other set those things aside and joined together in a time when we were promoting nationalism. And then thirdly, a rise in democracies. The push for nationalism resulted in some new countries forming and governments that they embraced, which were democracies. All right, there were some negative results of nationalism. Negative result number one. When there's a focus on nationalism, a lot of times there's minority groups that get focused on. A good example is like Nazi Germany. It's a little bit later than what we're looking at now, but certain groups get focused on, like, these people are the problem, or these people aren't like us. And so they cleansing, not in a good sense, but cleansing in a like eliminating them. And that happens sometimes with nationalism. Another negative, is nations that are feeling highly nationalistic within themselves, sometimes butt heads with other nations that are doing the same thing. They're both trying to establish which one is better, and sometimes that leads to wars, like we're going to see when we get to World War One. And then thirdly, I see sometimes that what makes us unique, like in America, we got all these different people with all these different cultural traits, and you put them all together, and that makes America. Um, and in times of intense nationalism, sometimes those lines are blurred, and everybody just becomes a little more like everyone else, and so those unique cultural traits sometimes get lost, which is what this phrase here means.